She called herself Mata Hari. Eye of the day, but she was born Margaretha Zelle in the Netherlands, a neutral passport in a city that had lost its sleep. Paris was the seat of a republic at war, its ministries guarded by ledgers, passwords, and men who spoke softly into keys after midnight. In 1917, the French War Ministry sought order amid grief. Loyalty was counted, guilt tallied, and rumor filed in folders the color of dusk. She was a dancer by reputation, a courtesan by scandal, and, depending on who kept the ledger, an agent, a decoy, or a scapegoat. Around her moved generals, attachés, a wounded Russian officer with a steady gaze, and a clerk who logged the hour. A letter never posted turned history's hinge. She had learned the choreography of power in ballrooms and antechambers. Move slowly, never give the first answer, keep a glove on when taking a hand. Once in Java, the sun had risen over palm fronds as a household woke to the daily order of empire. Flags hoisted, ledgers opened, prayers said. She had worn a ring then, too. Vows made on a church's stone while incense hung lightly in the rafters. Years later that vow had cracked, custody settled in a lawyer's sigh, and she became a woman of passageways. Rotterdam to Paris, Paris to Vienna, hotel corridors and stations smelling of steam and violets. The Paris she knew in 1916 and 1917 was a city of lists, rations, billets, names on memorials, and a city of salons, where conversation clattered like cutlery. She moved between them both. At the opera, she sat still as a portrait, a locket at her throat rumored to hold a child's hair and a pressed frond. In the War Ministry on the Rue Saint-Dominique, she entered a room where a captain with a careful mustache, one of those men trained to keep his features still, watched as she placed a letter on his table, her gloved hand withdrawing like a tide. They called him an intelligence officer. His ledger bore columns labeled with numbers, not names. He offered her tea, the courtesy of a nation at war. The stakes were said out loud. Borders, battalions, a winter of grief. She spoke of a wounded Russian officer she loved, a pilot barely older than the century, recovering in a hospital ward that smelled of antiseptic and violets sent by someone else. "Let me see him," she said, "and I will do what I can." What she could, and what she should, split like a beam of light through glass. In that room, the currency was not only francs but reputation, the brittle law of appearances. She had been photographed in gauze and jewels, framed by the same empire that now needed her papers stamped with a red seal. Church bells were B-notes in the city's score. The priest's corridor, the officer's corridor. They ran parallel, never touching, both constraining. She nodded when the captain named the crown prince across the border, that face on postcards, the emblem on buttons. If love and duty were to be reconciled, it would be in the quiet acts. A meeting, a briefcase closed, a fan lowered to cover a message written on a visiting card. The hotel had its own liturgy. At noon, a brass key slid into her door. A chambermaid, Jean, paused at the threshold, and in the mirror caught a glimpse of a white envelope perched beneath a paperweight. The weight was a small bronze sun. Jean saw, because attendants always see, the way a hand lingers after sealing wax cools, how a sigh carries a name. She herself had brothers in uniforms that didn't belong to the hotel, and her pockets carried yarn from home and a corner of a prayer card. It mattered, this seeing, this keeping of confidences that were not written anywhere. Afternoon would bring a carriage ride that circumvented a boulevard closed for a parade of widows. A detour past a church where candles stood like soldiers who refused to lean. In her bag, the dancer carried a locket, a folded letter whose words she had rewritten 3 times, and a compact mirror with a crack across one corner, a thin line like a fault in porcelain. She was to attend an appointment at the War Ministry again, and unspool a plan that sounded simple because plans always do. A pass would be stamped. Passage would be arranged. She would cross a border like a chaperoned thought, and in a town smelling of coal and soup, she would try to stand sightline with the German prince whose smile appeared like a stamp in papers she never held. Yet even as the carriage wheels bit into the street's frost, a specter took the seat across from her. It wasn't a person. It was consequence. The Republic's law, the Church's murmur, the Empire's appetite. It came as the memory of a courtroom where men in sashes spoke Latin words about promises. It came as a troop's roll call, the names of others gathered up by history's hand. She tightened her glove and watched the ring on her finger reflect the winter light. Thin, cold, a halo that didn't warm. "Duty," she whispered, and did not say to whom. Night gathered itself. The opera's chandeliers burned with a clarity no candle knew, and people searched for comforts that would not shame them. On stage, a soprano sustained a note that seemed to hold the world steady. In a sidebox, a man with a lapel pin shaped like a crown looked too often at the woman famous for her veils, and she either didn't see or pretended not to. In that prelude to 1917's reckoning, everyone kept a veil to hand. The fan became not an instrument of flirtation, but a small curtain behind which one could breathe. The anomalies did not come as thunder. They came as late notes slid under doors, carriages that stopped one street sooner than arranged, and a glove that did not belong to her, found beneath a settee in the lounge. Jean, the maid, noted the glove. It was too large for a woman, supple from wear, a foreign brand embossed inside the cuff. She placed it on a tray, as if evidence could be returned to its owner like a lost brooch. In the War Ministry, a clerk recorded that a Dutch passport presented at 11 bore a flourish in its signature different from the flourish last month. He smoothed the page and did not call attention to it. The book closed with a soft breath. She sent a note to the hospital where the Russian lay, the V in his name, written with a decisive arm of ink. It returned undelivered. A red mark in the corner like a rose that had lost its scent. Hotel attendants reported a gentleman who asked for her room number and used a name for her. Only those backstage still remembered. In cafe mirrors, she noticed a reflection one table back that remained when other faces changed. Someone patient, his collar too tight, hands folded around a teacup he didn't drink. The city's lamplighters lifted their poles as if in salute. She lowered her eyes and adjusted the veil's edge. Rumor had its own corridor, parallel to the minister's. In salons, people said the German attaché in Madrid had exquisite cuffs and a voice like a cello. Others had seen her disembark in that city a season earlier and counted the trunks as if they were paragraphs in a diary. She sent postcards with views of an opera house, a garden, a museum's cool staircase, postcards that charmed and were archived. A coachman remembered changing his route when a knot of demonstrators filled the boulevard. His horse skittered, and a letter slid out of her bag to the floorboards. He returned it, unaware of the name sealed beneath wax. Was it rivalry or romance? An officer she once dined with now failed to stand when she approached a table. His friend, a man of letters, rose too quickly, cheeks bright, and excused himself before he said something kind. A Russian nurse in a starched cap offered a word in the corridor of the hospital. "Come tomorrow," she said. "He has lost taste for letters." The nurse's eyes were soft and grave. They were not unkind. Desire and duty braided themselves into a rope that could steady or strangle, and in the silence between visits, a woman of 40 found herself recounting the coins in a purse that always seemed lighter than it should be. The War Ministry's corridors smelled of paper, ink, and polished brass. The captain with the quiet mustache looked, if anything, wearier. He'd begun to believe that information came with a price, and the price was always in the third column, never in the second. He listened as she spoke of the men who gathered near a certain balcony in Madrid, their laughter carrying like a procession. She told him what the attaché had let slip as if by mistake. Names that were initials, appointments written by a secretary with a particular slant, a rumor about whose train arrived late in a border city. He nodded and wrote and said the word service as a kind of prayer. One night, an envelope arrived at her door that bore neither stamp nor sender's name. Inside was a calling card with a single initial, and the narrow silk ribbon that had once bound a bouquet of violets. There was a time when a ribbon like that would have been pinned to a mirror until its color faded. Now it went into a drawer with a key, and its scent was stored with other things not to be touched. Jean found the drawer open one morning. She closed it gently and wiped the mirror so the crack's thin line looked more like an ornament and less like a wound. In cafes, a phrase began appearing in the dailies. H2. Followed by a dash and blank as if the typesetter had lost nerve. It was a rumor preserved in the diaries of men who liked to think they knew everything, and in fact knew the inside of their own minds very well. She, whose face could still unnerve a room, found herself losing ground to a moral campaign conducted by ink. Loose women, loose tongues, someone said in a queue for sugar. The queue shrugged and moved on. In the church near her hotel, a votive guttered and went out. Jean replaced it and did not ask which prayer it was meant to hold. The invitation was to a ball, but the word felt wrong for wartime. It was a gathering. The lamps low, the orchestra playing softly, the air thick with perfume that tried and failed to hide fatigue. In one of the vaulted rooms near the embassy quarter, she moved among uniforms and evening coats, men bowing to women as if the old world could be briefly reenacted. A black fan fluttered at her wrist. A single ring flashed when she reached for a glass. Near the staircase, a gentleman with a precise part in his hair and the quiet of bureaucracy in his bones asked if they could speak in an antechamber. She weighed the cost of refusal and nodded. In the antechamber, the carpet softened their footfalls. He spoke of Madrid, of a master of ceremonies whose courtesy hid the sharpness of his ledger. He knew, as such men always do, the place she had sat at dinner, and how many steps it took to reach the balcony where the air was cooler. He mentioned a message sent from Spain to Paris, a message whose code had not been changed as it should have been, a detail murmured like a rebuke. She felt the room tilt just slightly, as if a ship had turned. When she reached for her locket, habit, nothing more, it burned cold against her palm. What passed then could be called a negotiation or an interview. It was, in essence, a test. Could her love be choreographed into service? Could the service be paid without receipt? She did not ask for a sum. She asked instead for a stamped pass, a sealed letter authorizing her to visit the hospital at the front where V waited or did not. "I will bring you what I can," she said, and did not define can. The man nodded, placed a hand on the paperweight shaped like a laurel, and said, "Do not mistake the mood of the city. Grief hardens." It was not a threat. It was a forecast. Timing turns history into consequence. Days later in Madrid, the attaché with the impeccable cuffs leaned closer over a cafe table. He wore a ring too large for the hand, as if borrowed. He spoke of news to be had in return for obligations acknowledged. He spoke of a line of credit of considerations, of the way men at the front kept their secrets poorly when they were tired and the music was good. She let silence do what words could not. Then she told him, in a voice as level as the sea, that France had laid a claim upon her too. He laughed like a man amused by another man's optimism. When they parted, he pressed a note into her hand. It was not quite a bribe, and not quite a kindness. Back in Paris, the gatekeepers had changed. There were new names on the doors and an older impatience in the hallways. The investigating officer, this one with a face like a shuttered window, asked her where she had been in certain hours and where her money had come from. She answered with the grace of a stage, but timelines are not choreography. They are rails. On a small table between them, a letter lay sealed with red wax. The seal bore no signet, just a thumbprint, unadorned. He looked at it as if it were an indictment. She looked at it as if, with enough heat, she could soften it and rewrite what it contained. Then, the mistake. It was not flamboyant. A clerk, another clerk, not the first, noticed that a message arrived twice, once in a code already known to their office, and once in a form cleaned up as if intended to be found. H21 was a mark in the corner, and those who wanted to believe did believe. The room where they sat remained civil. Someone poured water. The captain with the quiet mustache did not look away when she reached for the glass. "Tell me what you told him," he said, and meant Madrid's man with the cuffs. "I told him what we agreed," she said, and meant the earlier night, when a promise had been sealed and a pass had been stamped. At a second gathering, smaller, tighter, she realized an appointment time had been shifted by 5 minutes. 5 minutes is where most lives turn. She arrived to find the man with the laurel paperweight gone, and another in his place whose spectacles caught light and did not let it go. He opened a folder and removed a photograph. Her, not as she would have liked to be seen, but as she had been. Hair-pinned, glove half on, a hand extended toward a fountain in a garden where soldiers used to walk with sweethearts who were now widows. He placed it on the table as if to anchor the conversation. He asked about a trunk sent to The Hague, about a receipt given by a man whose job title changed with the seasons. A bell sounded somewhere distant, perhaps a chapel 1 floor below. She breathed against her corset, finding the rhythm she used on stage when silence needed to become a sentence. "Do you believe in love?" she asked finally. Spectacles did not move. "Belief is not in my portfolio," he replied. The locket at her throat remained cool. The letter on the table remained sealed. She thought of the hospital where a nurse might be folding linens while the wounded slept. She thought of the ring she had once removed to wash her hands, and how it had spun on marble before coming to rest. She thought of whether she would be allowed to send one more note. The inquiry did not open like a novel. It opened like a ledger. Pages were turned. An examining magistrate read in a tone free of adjectives, dates, and places delivered as though they were the only language the room would admit. Outside, Paris rehearsed its ration lines. Inside, the tone of the Republic grew severe. The woman they called Mata Hari sat where those accused sit, upright as if the chair were a throne, and she had remembered, too late, the key to its secret drawer. A priest stood near the corridor, not intruding. The door to the bedchamber of her old life, dancing, veils, theater light, closed by degrees with each question. Witnesses were letters and men. A concierge spoke of comings and goings, none impolite. A driver testified to routes altered to avoid strikes or soldiers on the march. A roomkeeper, Jeanne, held both silence and sorrow in the same gaze. She said nothing. Her presence was enough, a reminder of all that staff learn and seldom state. The magistrate raised phrases sourced from cafes and cross-border chatter. Money paid in envelopes, the idea, still disputed, of a codename that could be hers and could belong to someone else wearing her perfume as cover. Proof moved like smoke. It curled, it suggested, it clung to fabric, and each time a window opened, it thinned. Ledgers collided with love letters. The figure of a Russian officer appeared, more in testimony than in person. Some said he was not loyal to her. Others said he was simply afraid, wounded to the edge of self, and mindful of a career that could not hold such scandal. A single note in his hand, if it existed, was not produced. The court weighed instead a telegram trace, a hotel bill with a corner torn, a receipt from a jeweler where a ring had been appraised that spring. The law made its own romance. It loved the clean line from act to consequence, and had less patience for the messy braid of wanting, needing, and paying for the past. Outside the courtroom, the church's bells tolled at odd hours, their schedule given to the wounded and the dead, not to verdicts. Inside, men in uniform considered whether the Empire's humiliation could be dressed in a single woman, Essie silhouette, and sent into the courtyard at dawn. There was an idea, cruel in its neatness, that morale required spectacle. She, who had once accepted applause genuinely, understood what it was to be looked at by hundreds, and to bear it without trembling. The difference now was that there would be no curtain call. "Do you confess?" the magistrate asked, not unkindly. "To what I am," she said. "Not to what you need." If a parlor confrontation occurred, and it did, it was not theatrical. It took place in a Warden S office, where a window opened onto a sliver of sky and a bird S small patience perched, peering in. A guard placed a cup of coffee by her hand. It was cold by the time she finished telling the story of Java, of vows spoken of a child's hair snipped and placed in a locket the day everything changed. The guard listened as men who cannot change the outcome sometimes do, fully, almost tenderly, and then he placed the cup in the wash basin and wiped the ring S print from the porcelain lip. The ledger of the day waited in the hall. Evidence never sharpened fully. Letters were alleged. Receipts were indicative. Assignations were rumored. The men who had given her gifts were not compelled to stand beside her. Their reputations remained tapestries hung too high to see the stitching. The court allowed her to speak. She did, in a voice that had once hypnotized a theater. "I danced as a fiction they desired," she said. "I am not the myth they require." The remark was not recorded. Not exactly. What entered the record instead was a paraphrase, a purifying of tone that imagined her less complex than anyone ever is. There was a quiet after the verdict where nothing made sense. Jeanne, in her own room, lit a candle and placed the little bronze sun on the windowsill as if it could call a dawn faster. In the war ministry, men signed documents they could not sign fast enough. A chaplain, a man who believed in endings as beginnings, stood in a doorway and did not impose his presence on a woman who might or might not ask for him. The law had done its work as the law understands it. It had found a place to put responsibility so that the empire could say, "We have acted." In the ledger, the day had a line drawn beneath it. It was not exile across water, but exile within time. The night before dawn, the hours that belonged to no one. In the cell, hands folded, she reread a letter that would never be sent. She pressed her thumb to its seal one last time, and listened to footsteps measure the corridor like a metronome. The ring lay on the table, its circle unbroken though it bore the nicks of decades. The locket's hinge whispered when she opened it, closed like a sigh. Outside, a lantern guttered, and a guard adjusted the wick with the care of a man preparing a ritual he wished to forget. In the city, a few knew. The war ministry had sent for the necessary orders. A coachman would be woken just before first light. A detail would assemble without speaking names, only numbers. Jeanne, who did not sleep, tied her hair with the ribbon that once held violets and walked to the church's steps. She did not ring the bell. She stood with her hand against the stone as if she could lend it softness. A chaplain, called, folded his stole into his pocket and set out without haste or delay. He had learned the rhythm of comfort. Not too soon to be mistaken for professionalism. Not too late to be mistaken for doubt. She was allowed to dress. She did so as for a performance. Not for spectacle, but for the dignity that presentation affords. The glove, she pulled on carefully. The veil, she tied not to occlude, but to frame her face as she preferred to be seen. There is a rumor preserved in a guard's note that she declined a blindfold, that she preferred open eyes because she had spent a lifetime looking into a crowd and finding a single face. Another rumor says she nodded to the chaplain, listened, and spoke a private word that does not need repeating. What is certain is that she stood, and the room did not shrink her. The coach's door closed with a click that sounded like a key in a lock. The fortress of Vincennes received them as it receives everyone, without appetite, without disdain. In the courtyard, the morning air held the kind of silence that is almost a sound. Of what followed, the record is precise in its sequence, and mercifully vague in its texture. A detail took its place. An order was spoken softly. She faced them. She may have smiled, a rumor again, or she may have done what most do. Breathe, once, deeper than before. The chaplain murmured. A bell far away marked the hour. Then the moment arrived as moments do. All preparation. No rehearsal. After, The sky did not change color to suit the occasion. The guards remained men whose hands had to be steadied. One was said to be young enough to be her son. The ring remained on the table in the cell until someone with a list came to collect effects. Ring, locket, mirror with a crack, a fan of black feathers, a letter sealed in red wax. Later, in a room where receipts were written, a clerk placed those items in a box and wrote the date in a small hand. He did not record scent, or warmth, or the way objects remember touch. He did record that the wax was intact. The Republic's order survived that morning, because orders often do. The dynasty at stake was not of blood, but of morale, the imagined lineage of honor that governments try to trace through acts of severity. Somewhere in a hospital, a nurse folded a sheet that had covered a man who had stopped sleeping without dreaming. The men of letters wrote as if ink could resolve what heart could not. In a church, Jean lit 2 candles and, because superstition is a second faith, placed the bronze sun between them. The candles trembled in a draught, but held. She stood until one burned lower than the other, then went home before the city woke fully. Time left rooms undusted and memories polished, unevenly. Decades later, when renovations rattled the Hotel Élysée Palace, workmen lifted a floorboard and found a ring caught between joists, a thin gold band with a scratch deep as a sentence. It could have been hers or anyone's, but a clerk who loved stories wrapped it in tissue and wrote a note. Found near the mirror. In another archive, a folded letter, still sealed with softened red wax, was catalogued with a trailing question mark. To V. The wax had bled slightly in heat once. Its impression held no crest, only the swirl of a thumb. A locket turned up in a private sale, containing a hair tress too fine to name, and a pressed frond of something like palm. Provenance was alleged. The seller repeated the legend. The buyer asked for the record. Historians dispute much that was printed in the months around October 1917. Some argue that radio traffic about a code-named agent was transmitted in a form guaranteed to be intercepted, an act meant to sacrifice a visible figure to save others. Some note that she spoke to both sides in the manner of a woman trying to convert beauty and charm into survival in a world rationed of kindness. Few claim certainty. Fewer claim purity, of state, of motive, of love. What survives beyond documents and rumor is the room in which power and tenderness stood facing one another. The War Ministry's corridors still smell of polish if you go in winter. The fortress at Vincennes keeps its courtyard unadorned, austere as a conscience. Portraits of generals crackle at the varnish. A dancer's photograph fades more beautifully than seems fair. In a register, her name was once crossed out with a single deliberate line. Erasure is its own inscription. But in mirrors crackled by time, objects return. A fan's eclipse of a face, a key turning once, a letter never posted, a ring that catches light and holds it with surprising ferocity. This is not an ending that satisfies law or legend. It is an ending that asks a question in a whisper history rarely hears. What do we owe the ones who loved poorly, but loved truly, and to the ones who judged precisely and too soon? In the end, the image that lingers is not the courtyard. It is a desk in a hotel room, the wax seal cooling in the dark, a ring turning once on marble and coming to rest.